Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm so excited. I finally get to share the 13 days of Craftoween with you. I'm sharing day 1. This is the box that it comes in. So you can see right away, it's a little bit different from the crafty advent calendars and the 12 days of Stitchmas calendars that Spellbinders has had. In this box, there are 13 different Halloween themed dies. There is a stamp set that coordinates to give sentiments for each one of those dies, as well as some Halloween colored sequins. So with the 13 days of Craftoween, we have inside our box, it's all wrapped in tissue paper. Mine got crunched on the trip over. So we have those sequins, we have this stamp set, and I love the different fonts to go with, as well as the variety in there. And then we have our pouches that have our 13 dies. So we don't have different windows to open like the advent calendars. We have each one in its own little folder with a little cellophane sleeve on it. So these will be perfect for storage. Now, when I first opened this, I was curious if the front of the package had clues to what was inside the package. So no way to find out other than opening each one up. I really like how these are packaged. I think they're packaged really, really well. And here you go. They don't have clues to what's inside. So on the left there, you can see what the dies create. On the right, you can see a little plastic piece with the dies taped to it, as well as a suggested basically sentiment at the bottom of the image on the left. So once I pulled these off of the sleeve, I die cut them off screen. There's only 4 dies in the first set, but you can see it creates this most adorable little Dracula. So they're really easy to organize. These are perfect for people that are, say, new to die cutting and don't want something that's really, really overwhelming. And it's also perfect for someone that really loves creating for Halloween, but doesn't necessarily want a ton of different things. This is a great way to just dip your toes in it and be able to create for Halloween or for the season, and do it a little bit at a time, say 1 a day, because there are 13 different days and you can open up 1 per day. So for my die cutting, I did Raven cardstock for the base of Dracula. I used some classic white for his little fangs. His face and hands were die cut out of some chiffon cardstock, and then his tongue, as well as the inside part of his cape, as in his shirt and arms, are die cut out of some poppy cardstock. I like the pop of red with it. So I like to glue everything with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so I could use it for large die cuts as well as teeny tiny ones. I can put as much or as little glue as I need to on the different areas. And with the liquid glue, it gives you some wiggle room. It gives you time to wiggle things in place to know that you have perfect placement, and then you can let it sit. I always put a large acrylic block here. I do it regularly with my crafting. It just keeps everything nice and flat. I can still see through it. So if by chance, when I put that block on top of it, if by chance it shifts something, I can easily correct it. I can make sure that everything is still lined up correctly. And also when I'm creating, I can put something on top, or put my little embellishments on top of that acrylic block and see below to the card underneath to know whether the design that I'm thinking is going to work, or whether I need to adjust what I'm thinking. So while my little Dracula is drying to the side, I'm going to take a piece of Hammermill Cardstock here, and I'm going to add a sentiment to it. Now I want to heat emboss this sentiment with white embossing powder, and don't worry, even though I'm using white embossing powder on white cardstock, it will show up later. This is the first time I've used this stamp set, so the first thing I want to do is take a white eraser and just go over the stamping surface. This only needs to be done 1 time. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue that are on those stamps, and it helps them to take the ink just a little bit better. I also like to stamp with a Misti stamping tool just to make sure that I can stamp it multiple times to make sure that I have a nice, crisp, clean, clear stamping. And it's a little bit harder to see when I'm using the VersaMark ink, but it's great to be able to stamp it multiple times in one spot to know that it's going to be stamping in exactly the same spot. I use some embossing powder tool on my cardstock to make sure that when I put my embossing powder on there, it's only going to stick to that VersaMark ink. That way I get a nice crisp embossed sentiment. I stamp that a couple times, and you can tilt to the left, or to look to the left or the right, and you can see some sheen on the cardstock where that is stamped. It's obviously really, really hard to see it on screen because it's clear ink on top of white cardstock. But in real life, if you look to the side of it and see a reflection of light, you can make sure that it is nice and clearly stamped and that you've got the full sentiment there. I poured my embossing powder on top of there. I like to use some super fine embossing powder, especially when doing sentiments. That way I have as much of the detail as possible. And then I use my embossing tool to heat that ink. Now, like I said before, I'm using white embossing powder on here, but I will be doing some ink blending on this background. So that white is going to show up once I do that embossing, or once I do that ink blending. A little bit harder to see when I'm doing the embossing, obviously, because it's white on white, but it will show up. I'm using 3 different distress colors for that background. I have some Twisted Citron, some Carved Pumpkin, and Villainous Potion. And yes, I may have just chosen Carved Pumpkin and Villainous Potion for their names because it worked with the fall Halloween theme of this calendar. So I'm going to start with some Twisted Citron on the bottom. I'm using some large Spellbinders ink blending brushes because they can get some really nice light ink blending if I want, or I can build that color up, but it also creates a nice edge to it. I don't get really harsh edges when I use these brushes, especially for backgrounds. They're not necessarily great for detailed ink blending on little die cuts and stuff like that, but for large area, because they're large brushes, they work really well. After that Twisted Citron, I did the Carved Pumpkin. And then I'm ready to do that Villainous Potion. And I have different brushes for each one of those colors so that I get the proper color and I don't have muddy ink blending here. You can do as much or as little ink blending as you want. I have my paper already trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, so I don't need to trim it down after doing that ink blending. When you're doing the ink blending, sometimes there's a little bit of a heavier edge where you're ink blending. And I really like that. I think it frames it in. So I like to trim down before I'm ink blending a background rather than doing it afterwards. I have a piece of black cardstock here that I have trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 inches. That way I have a really fine, narrow border around my image piece. Because Dracula isn't really, really big, I could easily have gone even smaller and done my ink blended background 3 3/4 by 5 and then done my matte 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches if you want to have a wider border to it. I wanted to see a lot more of that ink blending. And another way to make that ink blending a little bit more visually interesting would be to flick some water on there and then use some paper towel to lift that up, and then you have a little bit more texture. You'd still have some of that color, but you'd have some splatters on that background. I opted not to do that for this particular background, but I just wanted to share that that's an option there. So here we have our Dracula with that heat embossed sentiment. And you can see how that ink blending made that sentiment show up. Because there's several different sentiments in that stamp set, I thought it'd be nice to add a stamp sentiment on the inside of the card as well. So I just chose a very simple Happy Halloween. I am stamping that with my Misti stamping tool so that once again I can do it a couple times. And I'm also going to use some black Memento ink just on the bottom part of the sentiment. So we have a combination of that orange with the black. You could do other color if you wanted. Like I could say do green on the top and then purple on the bottom or something like that. I just went with the black because it was nice and simple and it coordinated with some of the black pieces or black elements on the front of the card. So once that is stamped, I always have a damp microfiber cloth in my craft room that I like to clean my stamps off so that I know that I'm not going to be getting ink all over my fingers. We have our finished card. Very, very simple card, but I just think that Dracula is absolutely adorable. I think he's just got so much life and so much character to him. I can't wait to see what is in some of the next days of our 13 days of Craftoween. I will be back again tomorrow. We will open up day 2 and then create something with that. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spent with me. Have a fantastic day.